before iron swords scraped against shields, long before alphabets shaped the way humanity recorded its thoughts. The ancient world was already speaking. Across the glowing deserts of Egypt and through the deep forests of Anatolia, empires whispered to one another through the hands of messengers, men who carried fragile clay tablets, pressed with the quiet weight of power. Distances weren't measured in miles, but in how far a message could travel before nightfall. Agreements were carved into sun-baked clay, only to be broken, rewritten under the very same sky. Every polite greeting carried a demand tucked behind it, and every lavish gift hid a warning no one dared say aloud. And in that thin space where ambition touched pride, one city stood at the center of everything, Kadesh, a crossroads of kingdoms, a prize coveted by both mighty empires. Its name would echo through history, for it was here that two great kings would one day draw near, leading armies of chariots, carrying dreams of victory, and believing that eternity itself waited to choose a side. Relax, breathe, and let the sands of time drift across your mind, because this is where the story begins. If you enjoy drifting through forgotten history, make sure to like the video and subscribe. Now, let's step quietly into the world of ancient Egypt and the Hittites, and uncover how peace was forged from chaos. Chapter 1. The Age of Rival Kings. The Late Bronze Age was a world held together not by borders, but by words pressed into clay. Across the kingdoms of the Near East, from the wetlands of the Nile Delta to the rugged mountains of Anatolia, rulers spoke to one another in the soft, wedge-shaped language of diplomacy. These tablets carried greetings, threats, pleas for alliance, and confessions of desperation. Hundreds of them survive today in the storerooms of Amarna, like faint echoes of voices calling across time. Among those voices was one from Rib-Hadda, the weary ruler of Byblos. His letters begin almost like a whisper, a man speaking into the dark. "Let the king, my lord, know that all my cities have risen against me." He begs for archers, for soldiers, for any sign that Egypt still remembers its promises. But under Pharaoh Akhenaten, whose attention drifted toward his new sun god rather than toward the fragile northern empire, no rescue ever came. As temples emptied and the old gods fell silent, Egypt's influence in Syria frayed strand by strand. For the small kingdoms of the Levant, Egypt's silence was more dangerous than invasion. Without her support, they were left standing alone before the storm rising in the north. From the stony plateaus of Anatolia, the Hittite Empire advanced, a disciplined, relentless force. Their king, Suppiluliuma I, turned ambition into a strategy that reshaped the map. He crushed the rival kingdom of Mitanni, replaced its rulers with his own sons, and stitched together a network of cities loyal to the throne of Hatti. Ugarit, now his obedient coastal port, delivered gold to his treasury every year. Amuru, once an ally of Egypt, sent copper and troops instead. And Kadesh, wealthy, fortified, positioned on the bend of the Orontes River, controlled the road linking the northern highlands to the southern trade routes. Whoever commanded Kadesh commanded the heart of Syria. Suppiluliuma understood this better than anyone. Where he could negotiate, he did. Where he could not, he conquered. In his own annals, the deeds of Suppiluliuma, he declares proudly, "I took the land of Mitanni. I divided it among my sons. No enemy stood before me." To the west, his banners reached the sea. To the south, they cast long shadows across Canaan. Egypt, meanwhile, was slowly learning how to rise again after the turmoil of Akhenaten's religious revolution. Military leaders stepped into the vacuum left by prophets and reformers. Horemheb, a soldier with iron discipline, restored order. His successor, Seti I restored purpose. For Seti, empire was not an old memory carved on temple walls. It was a reality to be reclaimed through action. When Seti I marched north, he carried more than spears. He carried the weight of Egypt's pride. He passed Jeru, swept through Gaza, and reached the cedar forests of Lebanon, where the names of earlier pharaohs still clung to weathered stone. At Kadesh, he faced the Hittites and shattered their front lines. For a moment, the balance of power returned. Egypt's sun shone once more over the valleys of Syria. But victories at the edge of empire rarely last. Distance erodes triumphs faster than defeat does. Before a decade had passed, Hittite banners were once again flying above the walls of Kadesh. Seti returned home knowing a truth all conquerors eventually learn: no city stays one forever. The uneasy peace that followed was thin as reed paper. Letters crossed between Hattusa and Thebes, filled with polite greetings and the word brother, though both sides knew that brotherhood ends where ambition begins. In the towns of Syria, merchants quietly traded with both powers. Princes changed loyalties twice in the same season, and Kadesh, ever cunning, ever calculating, perfected the art of survival by flattering whichever empire appeared stronger. In the north, the sons of Suppiluliuma fought for succession. Arnuwanda II ruled only briefly before the crown passed to his brother, Mursili II, a quieter man, but a far more patient strategist. While the world watched Egypt regain its footing, Mursili was already gathering the pieces of his father's shattered plans. Under his steady rule, the Hittite Empire once again turned its attention southward. In Egypt, Seti's young son was stepping into command. Ramesses, not yet the monumental figure history would carve him into, was ambitious, restless, and certain the gods intended him for something greater than peace. He had watched his father return from Kadesh, honored, but not victorious. For the young prince, honor was not enough. Syria felt the weight of two empires closing in like a tightening snare. Amuru's ruler, Benteshina, sensing which way the winds of power were blowing, pledged loyalty to Mursili II. Their alliance was sealed by marriage, one of the oldest currencies in politics. When news of this reached Egypt, it fell like an insult. The defection of Amuru was more than a loss of tribute. It was a blow to Egypt's pride. From that moment, a quiet decade of preparation began. Mursili summoned allies and vassals across Anatolia. From Arzawa came thousands of warriors, from Lucca more. Carchemish sent its own troops. 16 kingdoms answered the call, nearly 37,000 soldiers and 3,500 chariots gathering beneath the banners of Hatti. The plains of Anatolia trembled with the clang of forges and the rumble of hooves. Egypt responded in equal measure. Seti transformed the northern garrison into a new royal residence, Per Ramesses, the House of Ramesses, part palace, part war machine. Bronze furnaces burned day and night. New stables rose from the marshes. Scribes counted 20,000 men across 4 divisions: Amun, Ra, Ta, and Set, each with its own chariots, commanders, and pride. Mercenaries from the sea brought curved blades and wild laughter. Nubian archers arrived with bright feathers and deadly accuracy. By year's end, the greatest armies in the world stood poised across a land neither side could truly hold. Between them lay Kadesh, still claiming neutrality, still counting profits. Above them, even the gods seemed to watch with amusement. Egypt called upon Amun, the maker of victory. The Hittites prayed to Teshub, lord of the storm. Both had been summoned too often to ignore. While carpenters shaped chariot wheels and scribes sharpened their reeds, a new chapter of history was forming, one built on dust and deception. Later generations would carve its memory into stone, praising divine kings and heroic battles. But its beginnings were simpler and far more human. Messages sent, promises broken, and rulers who believed their names would never fade. None of them could yet see that, on the plains of Kadesh, the world they shared was approaching its breaking point. Chapter 2. The Ascent of Ramesses II, the child who would later carve his name into eternity, was born into a land still vibrating with the aftershock of old victories. Egypt had not fallen, far from it, but the brilliance of its campaigns had dimmed into memory. By the time young Ramesses stepped toward adulthood, the conquests of his father, Seti I, had become stories retold beside campfires. Cities regained were lost again. Borders shifted like sand under the wind, and soldiers whispered that Egypt waited for a leader who could steady the world. Ramesses grew up where incense rarely reached, the forward military posts of the eastern frontier. The crackle of leather, the bite of bronze polishing, and the gruff laughter of veterans shaped his early senses far more than temple hymns. To the warriors who watched him ride between tents, he was a promise of strength. To the priests who observed his restless determination, he was an omen, brilliant but unpredictable. As a boy, he learned that a kingdom survived not just through blade and shield, but through discipline, loyalty, and the fragile thread of fear that ran before battle. When he was still scarcely 10, the drums quieted long enough for Seti to grant his son an honorary command of the chariot corps. It was ceremonial, yet symbolic, a public declaration of succession. Ramesses absorbed every lesson he could, riding alongside his father near the Libyan border, steadying the reins with hands too small for the task, but guided by a will far greater than his years. The desert wind tore past him, and in its roar, he began to understand the rhythm of war. Not only its clash, but the silence that came before it. Around 1279 BCE, at roughly 25, he inherited the two lands. The coronation at Thebes unfolded like a ritual unfolding outside of time. Priests of Amun brushed sacred oils across his brow, and the golden Kepresh war crown caught the dawn and answered with fire. Chants climbed the temple walls as if trying to reach the heavens that had already claimed him as divine son of Ra, beloved of Maat, chosen of Amun. Yet beneath the rising hymns, Ramesses felt another truth settling into place. Divinity meant nothing unless proven. Egypt believed in gods, yes, but Egypt also remembered. It remembered famine. It remembered Akhenaten's turmoil. It remembered losing Syria to the Hittites. The young pharaoh understood that the throne he sat upon was steady in stone, but fragile in spirit. His answer was not to look to Thebes. It was to build anew. The delta was alive with marshes and river channels, a world half-shaped by water, and from that shifting land, he commanded an entire city to rise. Per Ramesses, the House of Ramesses. It was not simply a capital. It was a vision of a future he intended to force into existence. Foundations sank into mud where reeds still whispered of the sea. Clay bricks dried in the sun, stamped boldly with his name even before he wore the full authority of a king. Within a short span, storehouses filled with grain, stables overflowed with horses, and furnaces roared with molten bronze. Where Seti had marched, Ramesses planned. The new city's boulevards were wide enough for chariots to thunder in formation. Massive gates were carved not for ceremony but for armies. At dawn, shipyards lined the river, turning out transport vessels capable of racing north in days rather than weeks. Scribes recorded the growing armories in reverent tones, tens of thousands of spears, shields stacked like woven sunrises, and chariots gleaming under fresh lacquer. Veterans of past campaigns drilled new recruits, Nubian commanders, Libyan bowmen, and seafaring mercenaries from the Shurden tribes fought side by side. Ramesses cared little for bloodlines. He cared for precision. Those who excelled were welcomed to his table. Those who failed vanished from his monuments as though they had never existed. Diplomacy followed. From Hatti, envoys arrived bearing polished gifts and carefully worded letters sealed with the mark of Tarhunta, the storm god. Their messages smiled with peace while their armies tightened their hold on Kadesh. Ramesses' replies were equally graceful and just as insincere. Court officials, listening from behind gilded columns, understood the dance. War was inevitable. Only its timing remained flexible. Before facing the north, the young pharaoh tested his command. In his second year, he led a swift campaign westward against Libyan tribes. He rode his own chariot, drawing his bow until the string hummed like a plucked harp. He returned with captives and cattle enough to fuel the expanding labor force of his new capital. He then calmed unrest in Nubia, securing gold mines that glimmered with the wealth needed to finance future ambitions. These victories were not grand, yet they were carved into temple walls as if they shook the world. Reliefs at Abydos and Luxor showed Ramesses smiting chaos itself, art as rehearsal for the battles that truly mattered. At court, whispers changed. Poets began to speak of him as a new Thutmose III. Officials competed in praise. Even the priests of Amun, guardians of tradition, began to believe that perhaps the old dominion might rise again. But in the north, the Hittite king Muwattali II watched all of this with the patience of a man who had survived his own civil storms. He saw the growth of Per Ramesses. He heard of the chariot musters. His letters turned colder, formalities trimmed like dying branches. One tablet, written in Akkadian, ended abruptly, missing the usual blessing upon Egypt's king. Scribes recognized this small absence as a shadow of conflict forming. In 1275 BCE, the governor of Amuru, Benteshina, made his final gamble. After years of shifting loyalties, he defected once more, this time to Egypt. Muwattali saw betrayal. Ramesses saw justification. 4 divisions of the Egyptian army, Amun, Ra, Ta, and Set, were summoned. Each held 5,000 men. Chariots were rebuilt with lighter frames for swifter turns. 2-horse teams trained tirelessly across packed fields. In Thebes, new arrowheads cooled by the thousands. In Memphis, leatherworkers stitched harnesses until their fingers blistered. At Per Ramesses, the pharaoh inspected rank after rank of soldiers, their bronze catching the light like fields of rising suns. He passed them in his royal chariot, the blue war crown glowing above a calm, unreadable expression. Standards rippled behind him, falcon, jackal, bull, shadows of the gods he claimed as allies. When he spoke, he addressed the troops not as a distant monarch, but as one who would stand among them. "We have been silent too long," he said. "The North mistakes our stillness for weakness. We will show them it is strength." A roar broke across the parade ground like a tide. That spring, couriers rode ahead into Canaan. Wells were mapped, valleys recorded, friendly towns marked, hostile ones noted with caution. The road from Gaza to Megiddo to Kadesh was charted with a precision that later generations would attribute to divine inspiration. But it was the product of sleepless planning and relentless will. In Per Ramesses, artisans carved commemorative scarabs before the army even marched. They depicted the king alone in battle, bow drawn, enemies scattering like frightened birds. In Egypt, the future was often carved into stone long before it became real. At last, the Pharaoh set out. The winds of the delta swirled with dust and quiet omens as he left his shining capital at the head of a vast host. Behind him, priests offered libations to Amun. Before him stretched the long ancient road to Kadesh, a road where many kings had marched and many empires had withered. But none had marched with such certainty. Ramesses did not advance merely to restore the lands his father once held. He marched to convince the world, and time itself, that Egypt's gods still ruled, and that the age of their dominion was far from over. Chapter 3. The Rising Storm in Syria. The promise Ramesses carried from Egypt's heartland stretched far beyond its borders, like a thread pulled tight across the world. Dawn came pale and unhurried over the northern frontier, soft as breath yet sharp as prophecy. Near Gaza, the sands glimmered rose-colored before the sun revealed itself, a hue so delicate that even seasoned soldiers wondered if it was an omen. In that fragile light, Egypt's vast host began its long march northward. The chariots moved first, wheels gritting against hard-packed earth, their polished frames whispering of the power they carried. Infantry followed in steady lines, their shields catching the first gold of sunrise as the city of Ramesses faded behind them. Priests raised their hands in blessing, and the Pharaoh's standards turned toward the dawn, guiding the army toward the horizon like constellations made of linen and bronze. The march was not one of immediate conquest, but of unmistakable declaration. Ramesses rode at the front of the Amun division, his horses stamping restlessly, their gilded harnesses chiming in the breeze. The air held the scent of oil and polished metal, and beneath it, the unspoken fear of what waited in the north, the fortified city of Kadesh, the switchback loyalty of Amuru, and the shadow of a Hittite army rumored to be as vast as a moving sea. The betrayal that brought on this conflict had not struck all at once. Bentashina, ruler of Amuru, had long attempted to balance Egypt and Hatti like weights on a scale. His allegiance shifted with tribute. Egypt when gifts came from Thebes, Hatti when envoys arrived from Hattusha. But in the 4th year of Ramesses' reign, he chose openly. He forged a treaty with the Hittite king Muwatalli II and sealed it by accepting a Hittite princess as his queen. It was meant to secure Amuru's survival. Instead, it set the world trembling. In Hatti, the news did not bring anger, it brought satisfaction. Muwatalli had expected Egypt's eventual retaliation. He was not a ruler who blustered, he was a ruler who prepared. In the stone chambers of his capital, he convened his generals and began gathering forces from every Hittite vassal. From the western coastlands to the northern hills, warriors were summoned, 16 kingdoms offering their strength. Contingents arrived from Arzawa, from Lucca, from Massa, from Kitsuatna, from Aleppo and Carchemish. When the musters ended, Muwatalli commanded nearly 37,000 soldiers and 3,500 chariots, their campfires spreading across the plains like a map of the night sky brought to earth. Egypt answered with its own rising storm. Messengers raced the length of the Nile, calling veterans back to service, gathering Nubian archers, Libyan spearmen, and seafaring Shurden mercenaries. The 4 great divisions, Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Set, were reinforced until each held 5,000 men and 500 chariots. It was not an army alone, but a declaration of identity. Egypt was still mighty, still disciplined, still worthy of fear. In Ramesses, preparations overtook every hour. The clang of metal from the armories rang like ritual bells. Scribes counted rations, wrote names, and calculated distances. Priests murmured blessings over weapons older than written memory. Storehouses emptied grain, beer, and dried fish into caravans that stretched like a living spine behind the marching divisions. Surrounding the army was an entire moving city, servants, workers, drovers, and countless animals, none of whom would stand in battle, yet without whom the battle could never be fought. But the sharpest tool Seti had once honed, Egypt's intelligence network, had grown blunted in this campaign. Spies who had once traveled from Byblos to Ugarit with ease now moved hastily and carelessly. Bedouin messengers carried news north and south, yet their loyalties shifted with silver. Ramesses trusted them more deeply than he should have. In the quiet of hindsight, this was the first thread that loosened the woven fabric of his strategy. Far ahead, Syria waited under a generous season. Fields of barley shimmered green, and fig trees sagged with fruit. But beneath this abundance lay the tension of a land on edge. From Amurru to Tunip, whispers spread that two great kings were preparing for a reckoning. Traders carried tales of a pharaoh determined to reclaim Kadesh or perish before its gates. In Hittite towns, officials conscripted farmers and craftsmen who had never held more than a hoe, promising glory on Egypt's broken ruins. The atmosphere trembled as if the sky itself were holding its breath. For Ramesses, Bentashina's defection was not merely a diplomatic insult, it was a personal wound. In private letters, he called the Amurru ruler the dog of Hatti, swearing retribution so fierce that scribes recorded the vows only reluctantly. But beneath his anger lay an understanding. This betrayal granted him the moral ground to wage a war framed not as ambition, but as righteous correction. Egypt's gods favored such narratives. At court, Ramesses' generals debated their next move. Seasoned veterans of Seti urged patience, secure Canaan, strengthen supply lines, then push north. Younger officers, raised under Ramesses' bold command, pressed for immediacy. The pharaoh listened without comment, eyes fixed on the sprawling maps before him. When he did speak, it was with quiet certainty. "We will take Kadesh before Mu'atali knows we have left Egypt." It was not arrogance, it was intention. By late spring, the divisions were already moving. They advanced through Canaan along the coastal road, passing Gaza and Megiddo, before veering inland toward the rising hills. Villages along the route were required to supply food and water. Those wavering in loyalty received garrisons. Those defiant faced harsh lesson. The march moved like a gathering storm front, orderly, vast, unstoppable. Behind them, scribes marked each milestone. Day 3, Gaza secured. Day 10, Megiddo reached without resistance. Day 15, the governor of Yenoam offered tribute and safe passage. Day 22, the army entered the fertile Bekaa Valley. Ahead, scouts charted the narrow passes through the El Lebanon range, tracing pathways toward Kadesh. Each night, Ramesses studied their reports by lamplight, marking loyal towns in one color, uncertain ones in another, and lost territories in a third. The intelligence was incomplete and often contradictory, some claiming Mu'atali had retreated toward Aleppo, others insisting he was already near Kadesh. Ramesses chose to believe the former. It aligned with the victory he envisioned. In truth, Mu'atali was shaping a snare. His strategy was to lure Ramesses northward at speed, separating the divisions across long distances. Then, once Egypt's army was stretched thin, he would unleash his heavy three-man chariots from behind the Orontes River, hidden among wooded ridges near the fortress of Shabtuna. Traders working as Hittite spies moved south with false reports of the king's withdrawal. They found a willing audience among the Bedouin guides employed by Ramesses. As the Egyptian army approached the frontier, the nights grew sharper, the winds colder. Soldiers spoke of distant farms, wives and harvests left behind. Fires crackled with stories of the pharaoh's past victories, tales half believed, half hoped. Each morning new commands sent them forward. Dust spiraled behind them like smoke from a slow-burning fire. The divisions, however, were spaced dangerously far apart, 15 to 20 kilometers between each, linked only by exhausted couriers. It made the march faster, but at a price. If Muwatalli struck before they regrouped, Egypt would face catastrophe. Ramesses understood the risk, yet hesitation, to him, was a greater enemy than the Hittites. On the 30th day, the Amun division reached the outskirts of Kadesh. The city's dual towers glowed deep red under the evening sun, their banners still in windless air. Scouts returned with reports of no visible enemy forces. The inscriptions later carved in stone claim the pharaoh's heart lifted at the sight, believing the gods had cleared his path. He ordered camp to be made. In the flickering light of torches, the Amun division raised tents along the banks of the Orontes. Hammers tapped softly into the soil. Shovels carved trenches under stars that seemed strangely distant. Frogs croaked unseen in the reeds. Across the darkened plain, an army of 37,000 men settled into uneasy silence. They waited for the command that would break the quiet and bring the storm fully to life. Chapter 4. The March to Kadesh. The storm that had been gathering for months finally found its direction. Every step northward seemed to tighten the air, as though the world itself knew that whatever waited at Kadesh would not pass quietly. When Ramesses II departed from Pierre Ramesses, the wheels of his chariot rolled over the same soil once traveled by Thutmose III's armies a century earlier. Yet this was no campaign of reclamation. Ramesses marched not simply to take back land, but to assert the will of the gods themselves. And he told his court that those gods would ride beside him, though divine company, as every soldier knew, is never consistent from one horizon to the next. The journey to Gaza took 3 long days. Gaza welcomed its pharaoh the way it always had, with open gates, bread laid on platters, garlands draped across doorways. Scribes hurried forward to record every offering, measures of barley, jars of beer, sacrificial oxen, blessings from moon priests who prayed for a safe road ahead. Yet even they faltered when their eyes fell upon the endless procession trailing the Egyptian army. Carts creaked beneath mountains of grain and water skins. Thousands of animals plodded along with the slow determination of creatures resigned to labor. This was no marching force. It was a moving city, nearly 30,000 souls drifting across the Levant like a migrating constellation. By the 10th day, they reached Megiddo. Its walls still bore the wounds of a rebellion crushed long ago. Yet now the gates stood wide in reverence. Beneath the shade of ancient sycamores, Ramesses received tribute and felt the heavy imprint of his father Seti's campaigns lingering in the air. There he reviewed his divisions, Amun at the front under his direct command, Ra following a day behind, Ptah another day farther, and Set, slowest of all, bringing up the distant rear. Together they stretched across nearly 40 kilometers of winding road, a living chain shimmering beneath the desert sun. Each morning followed the same calm ritual. Trumpets stirred the dawn. Soldiers folded the night into neat bundles and hefted them onto carts. Charioteers murmured to their horses as though sharing secrets. Infantrymen formed their lines, 5 across, linen armor and bronze edges catching the early light like ripples upon the Nile. Between these human columns moved the lifeblood of the campaign, the quartermasters. 5,000 supply carts groaned beneath grain, equipment, and water. The beasts pulling them, consuming almost half the supplies meant to sustain the army. Every evening, scribes recalculated survival on clay tablets smudged with dust and worry. The land slowly softened as they moved northward. By the 15th day, vineyards crawled up the hillsides, and fig trees shaded the path. Farmers stood silently as the Pharaoh's host passed, eyes lowered, counting how many mouths they might be expected to feed or hide if forced to choose. Ramesses paid what he could, but foraging parties still swept the countryside. Mercy, after all, was not a currency a campaign could afford. On the 22nd day, they entered the Bekaa Valley. The heat loosened its grip, replaced by a cool wind spilling down from the mountains. They encamped near Kumidi, where the local governor presented himself barefoot in a gesture of humility, offering honey, maps etched onto bark, and apologies for whatever might be lacking. Ramesses rewarded him with a golden necklace and the promise, always valuable, that Egypt's goodwill could shape a man's entire future. The governor bowed again and sent his messengers riding at dawn, one toward Kadesh, the other toward Aleppo. In Syria, loyalties were measured not by devotion but by distance, and the distance between rival kings was never as wide as it seemed. Through the Illubru Valley, the army climbed along pathways older than memory itself. At night, when the campfires stretched in an unbroken ribbon across the darkened hills, travelers whispered that it looked like a fallen piece of the heavens, an earthly Milky Way. By the 30th day, they descended toward the Orontes plain, a region so fertile and fiercely contested that every empire of the last millennium had tried to claim it. Ramesses believed the gods had cleared his path. Messengers had brought reassuring news. The Hittite king, Muwatalli II, had supposedly withdrawn far to the north, toward Aleppo, 200 kilometers away. That information came from 2 Bedouin riders captured near Shabtuna, a small ford south of Kadesh. They were dragged before the Pharaoh, wrists bound, their eyes flicking nervously between the gilded chariot and the towering statues of the gods. "What have you seen?" Ramesses demanded. The elder knelt so deeply, his forehead sank into dust. "O mighty lord," he whispered, "the king of Hatti fears your might. He has retreated with all his forces to the land of Caleb. No army stands to challenge Pharaoh." The lie was spun so beautifully, so conveniently, that no one questioned it. Ramesses rewarded them with food and sent them away. His chroniclers would later call them the 2 Shasu spies, men whose deception nearly unraveled an empire. The next morning, the Egyptians crossed the ford at Shabtuna. The river was shallow, but the banks were treacherously soft, trapping carts in thick mud. It took an entire day to pull the vanguard across. Ramesses grew impatient as the sun dipped low. "If Muwatalli has fled," he told his commanders, "then Kadesh is already ours." He pressed ahead with the Amun division, leaving the Ra division a full day's march behind. Ta and Set followed even farther, stretched thin across the winding Syrian roads, held together only by the fragile hope that messages would reach them in time. But roads have ears, and Syria's roads were especially attentive. By nightfall, they reached the forests of Labwi, a dense tangle of oak and cedar capable of swallowing entire armies. The soldiers, accustomed to the open desert, moved quietly, unsettled by the greenery. Birds scattered as chariots passed, and when the trees finally parted, the Orontes River gleamed like the edge of a blade. Ahead rose the twin mounds of Kadesh, ancient, commanding, seemingly unprotected. Fields of barley shimmered beneath the soft evening light. To Ramesses, it looked almost peaceful, almost his. He ordered the camp built on the western bank. Sappers dug trenches, raised earthen ramparts, and placed shields along the walls to catch the sinking sun. At the center of the camp rose the royal pavilion, its carved lotus pillars and falcon motifs glowing in the torchlight. Banners of Amun fluttered overhead, Rows of tents stretched outward, each marked by standards shaped like sacred beasts. The air smelled of river dampness, smoke, and the sweat of thousands. Scouts rode into the dusk. One returned with 2 prisoners, Hittite soldiers found lurking near the trees. After hours of resistance, they finally broke under force and revealed the truth the Shasu had hidden. Muwatalli had not fled. He had been waiting, just beyond the hills northeast of Kadesh, with an alliance of forces more numerous than sand. The words drained the warmth from the air. Ramesses' camp was only half fortified, half prepared, and the Roar division was still a full day behind. Ta and Set remained far beyond reach. The silence in the royal tent pressed heavily against the walls until Ramesses stood and gave the only order possible. "Send riders south. Tell them to come with all speed. We hold the line until they arrive." Under torchlight, the soldiers of Amun continued their tasks, unaware of the army lurking beyond the dark ridges. Across the river, faint glimmers of the Hittite camp flickered like ghostly embers before the night swallowed them. For the Hittites, the preparations had already begun. Chariots were being fitted with reins and shields. Horses drank greedily from shallow streams. Each heavy war chariot carried 3 men, driver, shield-bearer, and spearman, standing in readiness. At dawn, they would cross the river, crush the Ra division before it reached Kadesh, and roll straight into Ramesses' half-built camp. The plan was flawless, the timing exact. But for now, the plain of Kadesh lay wrapped in stillness. Ramesses walked the perimeter before seeking rest. The moon hung low, turning ramparts silver. Somewhere beyond the trees, owls traded soft calls. He paused beside the small shrine of Amun, pressing his hand to the god's image. "You brought me here," he whispered. "Bring me back home again." No scribe recorded what answer, if any, reached him. At dawn, the horses stirred. The wind shifted, and from the east rolled a distant rumbling growl, not thunder, but wheels, the first sign that the Hittites were already moving. Chapter 5. The Hittite Trap Springs. The long march to Kadesh had ended, but the quiet that followed was only the breath before the storm. Dawn rose like a blade lifted from its sheath, slicing through mists and reflecting off the Orontes River. The Pharaoh's camp shimmered under the early light, bronze ornaments catching fire, linen tents stirring in the cool breeze. Trumpets signaled the morning watch, their notes drifting lazily through the air, unaware that an entire army crouched just beyond the curve of the hills. The scent of damp riverbanks mingled with the smoke of dying embers. Birds rustled in the cedar groves, restless as though sensing something the Egyptians could not yet see. For a few heartbeats, it seemed like any other morning of marching, drilling, and preparing for another day's progress. Then came the riders. 2 scouts burst from the north, clinging to their staggering horses. Even before they reached the ramparts, their shouts carried through the camp. Gate sentries pulled them inside, and one of the men collapsed at Ramesses' feet, his clothes crusted with dust and blood. Between ragged breaths, he revealed the truth that undid the Pharaoh's confidence. The Hittites had never fled north. Muwatalli II, king of Hatti, was lying in wait behind the rise, not far from the city walls, and he had brought with him contingents from every land under his rule. The words had barely settled when the earth trembled. A low, steady thunder rose from the northeast. It wasn't weather, it wasn't the shifting of trees, it was the rhythm of thousands of wheels. Over the crest of the hill spilled the first lines of Hittite chariots, hundreds, then thousands, moving as a single creature with bronze-bright scales and banners snapping like teeth in the wind. Muwatalli had hidden his entire force there, patient as a coiled serpent, waiting for the Egyptians to relax, to divide, to believe themselves safe. Now the serpent unfurled. Dust climbed into the sky in great sweeping walls as the Hittite chariots thundered toward the river. Each vehicle carried 3 warriors, the driver steady as stone, the spearman braced for impact, the shield-bearer gleaming in bronze scale armor that glinted like the skin of a river fish. They crossed the Orontes at the ford of Shabtuna in flawless formation. Spray flashed beneath the hooves of thousands of horses. 18 contingents swept onto the plain, nearly 2,000 chariots accelerating toward the Egyptian lines. Farther south, the Ra division was already on the road. They marched in long, relaxed columns, weapons slung lazily over their backs, the warmth of morning settling over them like a blanket. Some men were humming, some chatting. None of them knew the avalanche that had begun behind the trees. The thunder reached them first, then the shouting, then the chariots. The first impact was so violent, it unstitched the world. Horses screamed, wood shattered, bronze struck linen with a wet, terrible finality. The ground quaked beneath the weight of the assault. Before any officer could issue a single command, the Ara division collapsed like sand beneath a wave. Commander Amunemipet was thrown from his chariot and killed instantly. His deputy, Amenemopet, was captured before he could defend himself. The division's standard-bearer dropped the banner of Ra and fled into the reeds along the riverbank. Within half an hour, thousands were dead. Chariots lay overturned and burning. Survivors sprinted northward toward the Pharaoh's camp, stumbling in blood and dust with the Hittites roaring behind them. Inside the camp of Amun, panic spread faster than arrows. The first fleeing soldiers burst through the perimeter, shouting that the host of Hatti was upon them. Officers tried to gather them back into formation, but terror has sharper teeth than discipline. Some soldiers grabbed shields and ran to the embankment. Others scrambled toward the ford. Trumpets wailed from the royal pavilion, yet their calls dissolved into the rising chaos. Ramesses stood at the center of it all, armored from the night before, staring in disbelief at how quickly the polished order of his march had melted into confusion. He barked for the chariot line to form, though even his voice struggled against the storm of shouts and crashing wood. To the east, a massive cloud of dust signaled the enemy's approach, an entire wall of bronze chariots charging toward the camp. The first strike landed like a hammer. Hittite chariots smashed through the outer fencing, splintering poles, overturning tents, setting canvas aflame. The Pharaoh's guards fired arrows until their quivers ran dry. Axles screeched against the earth as chariots tore through the embankment. Warriors leapt from their vehicles with swords raised, cloaked in the heat of battle. The Egyptians fell back toward the shrine of Amun in the center of the camp. There, amid shredded banners and burning tents, 2 captured Hittites were dragged before Ramesses. Bleeding and half-broken, they confirmed what the scouts had said. Muatali II had brought an immense coalition, princes, vassals, and warriors from every stretch of his empire. More soldiers than could be counted, more than the sand itself. The truth stood stark. The Pharaoh was trapped with a single division, surrounded by the largest Hittite army ever assembled. He sent desperate runners south, ordering the remains of the Ra division to regroup and commanding the Ptah and Set divisions to march without pause. But the roads behind him were choked with wounded men, abandoned carts, and terrified animals. 40 kilometers separated salvation from disaster. Some of Ramesses' commanders urged him to retreat across the river while there was still time. "We can reform on the far bank and strike again," one shouted above the din. But Ramesses refused. "If I flee," he answered quietly, Egypt flees with me." He climbed into his chariot. His driver, Mena, tightened the reins. His shield-bearer stepped to his side. Around them, the soldiers of Amun formed a protective ring, shields touching, horses stamping anxiously. The sun climbed higher, turning the rising dust into sheets of gilded light. The Hittites surged again. Chariots tore through the camp like wild beasts. Wagons toppled, oxen stampeded, dragging entire carts behind them. Metal clanged, arrows hissed, men shouted names that vanished into smoke. Some Hittite crews, overcome with victory fever, abandoned the battle entirely to plunder the royal pavilion. They seized gold cups, sacks of grain, jars of wine, even furniture carved for the Pharaoh. And in that brief collapse of discipline, Ramesses saw his opening. He turned to Mena. "We ride," he said. What followed became the centerpiece of Egyptian memory for centuries. Ramesses drove straight into the churning heart of the enemy line. His horses, victory in Thebes and beloved of Amun, reared and plunged as he fired arrows with deadly precision from the moving chariot. Each time he wheeled in a tight circle, the Hittite formation buckled. For a moment, it seemed as though the Pharaoh himself carved pathways through bronze and dust. The truth was less divine and more human. Desperation sharpened his purpose, and his display of fury rekindled the courage of every soldier who saw him. The survivors of the Ra division, burned with shame and grief, returned to the fight. Together with Amun's warriors, they pushed the Hittites back toward the river. The plain became a churn of mud and crimson. Horses slipped, men clashed. The air stank of sweat, iron, and fear. By mid-afternoon, the first Hittite assault unraveled. Their chariots, after plowing through the camp, found themselves tangled in wreckage, unable to maneuver. Egyptian infantry stormed in with curved blades, dragging Hittite soldiers from their chariots and striking them down in brutal, personal combat. The sound was close and suffocating, a world reduced to breath, dust, and blade. Across the river, on the heights near Kadesh, Mu'atali watched the chaos. Princes from his vassal lands stood beside him, waiting for his command. The victory that had seemed so inevitable now flickered with doubt. The Pharaoh still lived. Egyptian reinforcements were creeping closer. Mu'atali hesitated, then sent for another wave of chariots. But the day had already turned. By sunset, the plain was a graveyard of broken wood and shattered shields. The Ra division was all but destroyed. The Amun division mauled but unbroken. The camp smoldered, a forest of crushed wagons, fallen tents, and cooling bodies. Smoke drifted across the river like ghostly fingers. The Hittites had failed to kill the Pharaoh, but they had crippled his army. Ramesses stood amid the wreckage, armor dented, dust streaked across his face, staring at the devastation with unreadable eyes. As night fell, the survivors gathered the wounded, buried their dead, and scavenged weapons from the fallen. Fires burned low, flickering like exhausted stars. The air hung heavy with the scent of charred wood and quiet dread. Somewhere beyond the darkness, the rest of the Hittite army was already preparing for dawn. Chapter 6. The Collapse of the Ra Division. The rest of Egypt's marching columns continued onward, step after weary step, unaware that the battle they expected still lay ahead had already erupted miles to the north. By midday, the heat had thickened into something tangible, a heavy cloak that settled on skin and armor alike. It clung to the throats of soldiers and the flanks of their horses, turning breath into something slow and labored. The plain south of Kadesh shimmered beneath the unsteady veil of mirage, and in that wavering haze, discipline slowly unraveled along the dusty road from Shabtuna. What had once been the proud marching formation of the Ra division was no longer an army at all, only a scattering of survivors, stumbling forward in a desperate, broken tide. Their unit had shattered hours earlier during the first brutal charge of the Hittite chariots. What began the day as confident ranks had dissolved into isolated clumps of men fleeing in all directions. Soldiers who had sung at sunrise were now stripped of weapons, of purpose, of everything but the instinct to survive. Linen kilts were torn, sandals abandoned in the dust. A few clung to bent spears or cracked bows, but most carried nothing except their terror. At the head of this scattered stream rolled the ruins of the division's chariot corps. Axles snapped, wheels split, horses staggering on trembling legs and bleeding from overexertion. The men cried out for direction, for water, for some sign that safety lay ahead. But behind them, the sound grew louder. The terrible rhythmic thunder of the pursuing Hittite vanguard, gaining ground with each breath. And then at last, through the haze of dust and heat, the battered survivors glimpsed what they mistook for salvation. The banners of Amun's encampment fluttered above the earthworks. Cook fires still smoldered. The outlines of tents shimmered in the warmth of the air. A chorus of delirious relief rippled through the fleeing Egyptians. They began shouting, calling out to the camp, never realizing that what awaited them was not refuge, but devastation. Inside those same ramparts, Ramesses was locked in a struggle to hold disaster at bay. His royal guards, battered but unbroken, had driven back the first wave of the Hittite assault toward the shattered gates. Yet more chariots were already splashing through the river shallows, crossing with grim precision, the weight of their charge shaking the ground. The screams of men crushed beneath hooves blended with the roar of bronze wheels rolling over earth and bone. Officers bellowed orders, but their voices vanished into the storm of chaos. And then, like a second tide, crashing onto an already broken shore, the remnants of the Ra division stumbled into the camp from the south. Their arrival brought no strength, only confusion, hundreds of panicked men, wounded animals, broken carts. All of it overwhelmed the fragile lines, struggling to hold the perimeter. The camp's defenses collapsed again, splintering like reeds before a flood. Hittite warriors surged through the ruined walls, bronze-tipped spears flashing in the sun as they pressed deeper into the heart of the Egyptian position. What followed was later carved onto temple walls, though no carving could ever capture the sound. Names were cried out and lost instantly under the clatter of shields and iron-bound wheels. Horses screamed as reins tangled around their legs. Oxen broke free of their posts, dragging wagons through columns of infantry. Burning tents vomited smoke into the sky. Oil jars burst into flame. The battle became a single consuming roar in which every voice, every command, every plea drowned. From the royal pavilion, Ramesses watched his army tearing itself apart. The world seemed to compress around him again, the pounding in his ears, the flashing movement of enemies and allies alike, the blur of bronze and dust. A spear flickered toward him. Instinct guided his hands. He drew his bow, released, and somewhere within the maelstrom, the attacker collapsed. For a moment, the Pharaoh's pulse steadied. Chaos did not frighten him. He had been raised in its shadow. Beyond the camp, the Orontes River had become a churning grave. The shattered remnants of the Ra division fled toward the ford, colliding headlong with the advancing Hittites. Chariots smashed into one another in the shallow water, their wheels locking together. Horses stumbled, plunged, and were dragged beneath the press. Broken equipment floated downstream. The river swelled with mud and blood until its surface became the color of rusted bronze. A papyrus later recovered in Thebes, written in a trembling hand by a scribe who somehow survived, described the scene only with the words, "They discarded everything, bows, spears, sandals. The field lay covered in bronze like reeds after floodwater recedes. No more poetic or painful summary could ever be written. The Hittite chariots pressed relentlessly through the confusion, their heavy axles crushing anything in their path. With 3 men in every vehicle, a driver, a warrior, and a shield-bearer, they moved like mobile fortresses. Wherever they carved a passage, the earth behind them became ruin. Yet, as often happens in the wake of triumph, confidence eroded discipline. Drunk on victory, several Hittite contingents peeled away from formation to loot the Egyptian camp. They ransacked the royal pavilion, finding chests still open and filled with treasures, golden cups, ceremonial furniture, even the richly embroidered canopy of the Pharaoh himself. Those few minutes of greed became the hinge on which the battle turned. To the south, a faint sound, easily mistaken for wind at first, began drifting across the plain. Horns. The battered survivors of the Ra division were finally reforming, pushed by grim-faced officers who dragged the wounded back into line. Their standards were gone, their strength perhaps half of what it had been at dawn, but fury welded them together. Behind them came a small, dust-covered contingent of chariots from the Ptah division, racing toward the camp in answer to the Pharaoh's call. These reinforcements were not enough to win the battle, but they were enough to keep Egypt breathing. Ramesses seized the moment. Gathering what remained of his guards, he mounted his chariot once more. The horses stamped and trembled beneath him. He lifted his bow toward the heart of the chaos. "Follow me," he cried, his voice firm and unshaken. "The coward dies in retreat. The brave die remembered." With that, he plunged straight into the storm. His chariot cut through the flames and drifting smoke, the horses surging where others balked. Arrows hissed past him, but his own bow sang faster. Hittite plunderers, startled in the midst of looting, turned too late. The counterattack crashed into them like a wave. Ramesses drove them backward toward the river where their own wagons clogged their escape. Then the sky shifted. The heat broke. Clouds gathered over the Orontes, dimming the harsh sun. The wind changed direction, carrying the scent of rain and burnt wood. Around the Pharaoh, Egyptian charioteers rallied to his banner, their voices rising in a single hoarse cry that echoed across the battlefield. For the first time that day, the tide turned, but the price was unbearable. 2,000 Egyptians lay silent on the plain. 500 chariots had been smashed beyond any hope of repair. The Amun division was reduced to a third of its strength. The sacred standard of Ra, proud symbol of a nation, had vanished. And still Ramesses stood, alive only by will and chance. As the battle ebbed, he stepped from his chariot onto the uneven ground. The earth beneath him was slick with mud and blood. Bodies lay so thickly that names, ranks, identities blurred together into a single tragic mass. Mena stood nearby, reins in hand, the royal team trembling, their coats streaked with foam. "We are alone, my good lord," he murmured. "The army is gone." Ramesses looked at him, dust streaking his face, bronze dented across his chest, and replied quietly, "Then Egypt will stand on what remains." The camp's fires dwindled as the sun dipped. The evening wind carried the bitter scent of death across the plain. Far to the north, the Hittite horn sounded once more, not for pursuit, but to summon their warriors back to regroup. The first storm of the battle had exhausted itself. Both armies, bruised and shaken, retreated into the fading light to tend their wounded and count their losses. That night, the rain finally fell. Soft at first, gentle enough to turn the ash into sticky mud. Soldiers huddled beneath scraps of linen or simply lay motionless, drained of everything but breath. Some whispered prayers, others stared into nothing. The torches of the approaching Ta division flickered faintly in the distance. Coming too late to undo the ruin of the day, Ramesses did not sleep. He sat beneath the limp royal banner, listening to the soft dripping of rainwater down the poles of his tent. Now and then, a horse cried out in the darkness, or a dying man called for someone long gone. The sounds blended with the rain until the night became a single soft hum, heavy, mournful, and strangely peaceful. At dawn, the world was quiet. Smoke curled upward from burnt chariots. Bodies were already being burned to stave off disease. The river ran high, pulling the dead gently downstream. Among the survivors, the talk was not of triumph or defeat, but of endurance. They had lived through the unimaginable, and for now, that was enough. Far to the north, high on the slopes overlooking the river, the Hittite banners still fluttered in the morning breeze. Muwatalli's camp remained intact. His chariots had bled Egypt nearly dry, but the Pharaoh had eluded him. Between the two armies lay the field of Kadesh, quiet for the moment, yet still trembling with the memory of wheels. Ramesses' survival bordered on the miraculous, but miracles are never the end of a story. They are the doorway to the next reckoning. And the storm, though quieted, had not yet passed. Chapter 7. The Stand of the Pharaoh. The storm did not end so much as it drifted away, leaving the world hushed in its wake. As dawn crept across the plain of Kadesh, the soaked earth breathed warm mist, and the sense of wet soil, ash, and trampled reeds rose with it. Across the Orontes River, the Hittite encampment stirred like a great beast waking from troubled dreams, distant horns, the snap of reins, the slow churn of wheels. To the Egyptians listening in the silence, those sounds foretold that the violence of yesterday had only paused, not passed. Ramesses had risen long before the first hint of sunlight. Too weary to rest, he had slept in his armor, the bronze chilled against his skin. The walls of his tent were streaked with dried mud, and the smoke of burned chariots clung to his hair like a memory he could not wash away. Outside, horses stood in rows, their coats still dark from the storm, steam lifting from them in thin ghostly ribbons. He stroked the neck of Victory in Thebes, his lead mare, feeling the tremor of exhaustion in her muscles. She was tired, so was he. But there would be no turning back. Scouts arrived with reports. Movement upriver, the gathering of Hittite chariots once more. Ramesses listened quietly. He had learned the rhythm of war at Kadesh, the creak of leather straps, the murmur of men preparing themselves for another morning they feared they would not see through. Around him, what remained of the Amun division worked in heavy silence, reshaping spearheads, restringing bows, wiping blades clean of rust and blood. None asked what came next. Every man understood the truth. They were all that stood between Egypt and oblivion. The Pharaoh walked among them, and heads lifted from their preparations, faces smeared with dust, eyes hollow from sleeplessness, yet steady. Ramesses spoke softly, almost more to the dawn than to them. You do not stand alone. As long as you breathe, Egypt breathes beside you. It was not a proclamation, not a cry for glory, only a simple truth offered to fill the space where fear tried to grow. As the sun climbed, the mist burned away, and from the north a thin shimmer of movement began to pulse along the horizon. Dust rose in long, trembling banners. Bronze flashed like sparks. Muwatalli II, watching from the far bank, had reorganized his forces. A second wave was approaching, larger, heavier, hungrier. Ramesses mounted his chariot. Mena, his shield-bearer, climbed beside him with practiced calm, reins coiled in one hand, a battle-axe resting against his arm. They are many, Mena murmured. They always have been, Ramesses answered. Then the Hittite host emerged fully from the haze, thousands of chariots arranged in deep ranks, bearing the emblems of vassal kingdoms from Halab to Carchemish. They moved like a bronze tide, 18 great squadrons rolling forward, each one wide enough to shake dust loose from the stones. What remained of the Egyptian army formed a shallow curve along the plain, chariots in front, infantry braced behind them. The earth beneath their sandals was still stained dark from yesterday's slaughter. Far to the south, faint pillars of dust hinted that the Nearin reinforcements were still on the march, but they were too distant to matter now. Whatever fate awaited Egypt would be decided before those allies arrived. The first Hittite wave struck with a force that felt like thunder rolling across the ground. Arrows hissed through the air, hammering shields and plunging into the flanks of horses. Egyptian chariots darted among the heavier Hittite ones, weaving instinctively through the chaos. The battlefield dissolved into a tangle of splintering wood, shouting men and flashing bronze. Ramesses did not hesitate. He drove straight into the heart of the assault, wheels spraying mud, his bow drawn so fiercely that the string quivered like a plucked lyre. Arrow after arrow vanished into the storm of dust and screaming hooves. Later, poets would call it divine fury, as though Amun himself had ridden in the chariot that day. But in truth, the Pharaoh fought with the clarity of a man who had nothing left except his will. 8 times he carved a path into the Hittite ranks. 8 times he returned, only to hurl himself forward again. Chroniclers would later give those charges grand names: the scattering of the warriors of Aleppo, the breaking of the men of Ugarit, the fall of the chiefs of Lucca. But in that moment, Ramesses knew none of those titles. There was only breath, motion, release, draw the bow, turn the chariot, strike again. The chariot bucked beneath him, wheels shrieking. Mena guided their horses with instinct born from endless training. "To the right!" Ramesses called. Mena swerved, narrowly avoiding an overturned chariot. A spear clipped the Pharaoh's arm, leaving a shallow line of blood. He barely registered it. For a heartbeat, as the dust thinned, Ramesses glimpsed the river glinting like a blade. All around him, bodies lay heaped, Egyptian, Hittite, indistinguishable, in ruin. Yet still his men held. And then something shifted. The Hittite formation began to knot upon itself. Too many chariots pressing into too small a space. Drivers shouted, wheels locked, horses stumbled. Ramesses seized the moment. He called for his archers to target the reinsmen. One by one, the enemy formations wavered. Across the river, Muwatalli II watched the disintegration with growing unease. His vassal princes argued around him. "Send in the reserve infantry," urged some. "Wait, the Egyptians might be luring us into a trap," warned others. Muwatalli hesitated, and that single moment of doubt saved Egypt. Ramesses pressed harder, cutting deep into the unraveling ranks. His banner, blue and gold, rose above the dust like a fragment of sky torn free. A soldier near him shouted, voice cracking, "My lord, we are surrounded!" Ramesses did not turn. "Then I am surrounded by victory." History would debate whether he truly said those words, but the men who heard them believed them. Faith, real or imagined, became another weapon in his hands. By late afternoon, the first Hittite wave had collapsed and fled back across the Orontes. Their remaining forces hesitated, unwilling to cross the field where so many of their own lay broken. Smoke drifted from burning chariots, tinting the sunlight a melancholy copper. Ramesses finally stepped down from his chariot. His armor was dented, his bowstring frayed. Around him, the battered remnants of the Amun and Ra divisions gathered, bloodied, exhausted, but alive. Mena offered him water. The Pharaoh's hands trembled as he accepted it. Nearby, Soldiers were recovering the bodies of prominent Hittite commanders, princes, chariot officers, the brother of the king. Their names would someday be etched into temple walls as symbols of triumph. But tonight, they were simply markers that the worst of the storm had passed. As dusk thickened, the wind carried the metallic scent of blood mingled with the promise of coming rain. Soldiers collected arrows and rebuilt makeshift defenses. The wounded lay along the riverbank, their soft groans mingling with the evening insects. Ramesses walked among them in silence, torchlight flickering across his face. He had survived what should have been annihilation, but survival was not victory. Across the dark water, countless Hittite campfires burned. The night would not bring peace, only the quiet before another reckoning. Chapter 8. The arrival of the Nerin. Night settled over the plain of Kadesh like a weary sigh. Egypt's army lay scattered and thin, its dead unburied, its camp little more than a ring of torn tents and guttering lamps. Yet the king still stood unbroken. In the dim glow of an oil flame, Ramesses murmured a prayer to the rising moon, something between a confession and a challenge. Father of light, have you turned your face from your son? I walk where you command, yet the shadow grows long. Outside, distant flashes of lightning flickered over the horizon, faint reminders that the storm that had ravaged the battlefield had not departed, only paused, waiting for dawn to draw breath again. The Egyptians slept little, if at all. Groans drifted from the wounded, mixing with the crackle of dying fires. Across the Orontes, the Hittite camp glowed with hundreds of small flames, constellations scattered across the dark hills. Men watched those lights with tight jaws, unsure whether morning would bring another thunderous assault. The Pharaoh had not removed his armor. The bronze plates, dented and dulled by blood and dust, caught the faint firelight as he walked through the camp, stepping past men who sat beside fallen comrades, heads bowed. At daybreak, the new light revealed a landscape carved by ruin. Broken chariots lay overturned like discarded shells in the soft mud, their wheels lodged at odd angles. Leather reins dragged across the ground like torn sinews, and the river carried pieces of shattered weapons toward the distant sea, spears, shields, and the bodies of horses drifting silently downstream. The makeshift palisade around the Egyptian camp had been nearly destroyed during the previous day's fighting. Whatever remained of the Amun and Ra divisions stood behind the remnants, shields cracked, armor tied together with rope, exhausted eyes fixed on the far bank. Across the water, movement stirred beneath the banners of Mu'atali II. The Hittite king could see that his first great assault had failed to kill the Egyptian ruler, but he believed the field still belonged to him. Behind him waited the contingents of 16 allied states, their chariots repaired, their infantry reinforced. Ramesses watched them from the edge of the ruined camp, unable to know how many more enemies would emerge, only that they would come. The earth between them was already a grave for thousands. Another clash would turn it into something darker. He ordered the survivors to contract their line, building new ramparts from whatever debris they could find, splintered wheels, broken shields, chunks of wood hardened by fire. A shallow trench was dug before the front ranks. Priests moved among the soldiers, pressing ash onto foreheads and whispering the names of gods in low, steady tones. No one truly believed the rituals would halt what approached, but the motions softened the silence. By mid-morning, the sky cleared, leaving the air shimmering with heat. From the north came the first signs of the renewed onslaught, dust rising, banners unfurling, bronze glittering like scattered stars. The Hittite chariots stretched wide across the plain, their infantry shadowing them in dense formations. The Egyptians braced, half their former strength, but their line held firm. Ramesses stood in his chariot at the center, the tall blue crown framing his features, his expression as still as polished stone as the first flight of arrows hissed across the river. The Hittites crossed at the ford near Shabtuna, the same passage through which they had surged the previous day. Horses screamed as they fought their way up the bank, their weight dragging the heavy chariots behind them. Wood and metal collided with the wet riverbed in a deafening roar. Then, as though struck by a single pulse of fate, the entire Hittite formation lunged forward. Dust swallowed the plain. The first wave crashed into the Egyptian wall, splintering against it like water against rock. Men fought knee-deep in mud, striking at shadows inches from their faces. The Hittites fought with numbers, the Egyptians with desperation. For an hour, neither side gave way. The battle was a single trembling heartbeat, stretched thin across the field. Then something changed. A new sound entered the chaos, sharp, bright, cutting through the low thunder of chariots. Ramesses turned, searching the haze. At first, he saw only a mirage, a slender column of men sweeping along the western ridge, their banners flashing gold and crimson in the sun. The wind turned, and the emblems became unmistakable. Egyptian standards, the falcon of Horus, the solar disk of Ra, the Nearin had come. They had marched from the coast, veterans and Canaanite auxiliaries drawn from the ports of the northern territories. Their commander, Anat-Her, had driven them through valleys and night roads to reach the battlefield in time. 2,000 men. Too few to overwhelm the Hittites, but enough to change the very atmosphere of the plain. Their dust rolled down the slope like smoke from a new flame. Mu'attali's charioteers did not notice at first. They were too deep in their advance, cutting toward the Egyptian center, aiming for the royal banner. The first Nearin arrows fell among them in a sudden rain. Horses reared, drivers shouted, ranks bent beneath a threat they had not imagined. The Nearin struck the Hittite left flank like a narrow spearhead, every step measured, every volley coordinated. Their first hail of arrows tore through the unshielded chariot crews. The second volley targeted the horses. The shock rippled through the Hittite line. From his position, Ramesses saw the shift. The moment the tide of battle cracked, he raised his arm. The remnants of the Amun and Ra divisions surged forward, their cries rising above the grinding of wheels. For the first time since the campaign began, the sound of the battlefield carried a note that felt like hope. On the high ground across the river, Mu'attali saw the collapse. He called for his reserves, but the order came too late. The allied contingents from Arzawa and Massa, already shaken, buckled under the force of the Nearin charge. Their retreat turned swiftly into panic. Men dropped their weapons and fled toward the river, stumbling over the fallen. The Orontes became a churning mass of bodies and overturned chariots. Horses plunged into the deep current, dragging vehicles after them. The water frothed with struggling men and sinking armor. Egyptian records would later claim 1,000 drowned, including a Hittite prince named Hattusili. Whether the number came from truth or triumph, the river bore witness for days, carrying debris and bodies far downstream. By late afternoon, the field belonged to Egypt. The Nearin merged with the shattered Egyptian ranks, forming one thin, resilient line. The survivors gazed across the plain, where the Hittite army had stood at dawn, and saw only drifting dust and emptiness. Ramesses dismounted, his legs trembling as his boots sank into the soft earth. Men were shouting victory, but he walked in silence through the wreckage. Splintered wheels, crushed bows, the ashes of burned chariots still warm beneath his feet. The plain smelled of cedar smoke, blood, and sweat baked under a harsh sun. Commander Anat-Her approached, saluting with a fist to his chest. "We came as swiftly as the roads allowed," he said quietly. Ramesses nodded once. "You came at the moment the gods desired. That night, For the third time, they rebuilt the camp. Fires lined the riverbank, glowing like small suns. The wounded were tended in circles of torchlight. Priests poured offerings not only to Amun and Ra, but to the unknown guardians who had carried the Nearin safely across the valleys. No one spoke of triumph. They spoke only of endurance, of having stood when the world pressed in, and of still standing now. Across the water, the Hittite camp was silent. Muatali's losses had torn the strength from his army. He dismissed his vassal allies to their homelands, offering no orders for renewed battle. Egypt, too battered to pursue, held its position and awaited the sun. When dawn finally came, both kings looked upon the same river from opposite shores. Between them drifted the remnants of everything they had commanded: broken chariots, shattered banners, fallen men carried by the slow, indifferent current. No treaty was signed, no envoy crossed the bank, only the faint retreat of silence, the kind that settles when warriors understand just how thin the boundary is between glory and survival. Ramesses remained beside the water until the last of the bodies passed out of sight. Chapter 9. The Stalemate on the Orontes. The wind that drifted across the Orontes plain was strangely cool, carrying the scent of distant rain mingled with the fading smoke of battle. Ramesses gazed northward toward Kadesh, its walls still unbroken, standing grim and unmoved after all the blood spilled beneath them. He understood then that the city would not fall, not to him, not today. The campaign had delivered neither triumph nor humiliation. Yet for the Egyptian king, whose future inscriptions would polish every moment into victory, simply surviving the storm felt like its own kind of conquest. And so, under a sky slowly filling with stars, the weary army at last surrendered to sleep. Among them lay the officers and foot soldiers who had fought through the chaos and terror of the previous day. They rested side by side, Egypt and Canaan alike, their campfires burning low for the first time in days. No horns shattered the darkness, no frantic cries leapt into the night. Only the buzzing of night insects and the faint whisper of wind weaving through the river reeds reminded them the world had not ended. The battle itself was not finished, yet its shape, its ferocity, had shifted into something quieter, heavier. Morning would reveal what all men already sensed. No god had seized the field, no banner had claimed the day. Only endurance had prevailed. A mute understanding lay between both armies, stretched thin across the river like a breath held too long. In that uneasy hush, the world did not find peace exactly, but something resting very close to it. Smoke lingered long after the clashing had ceased, drifting like pale gauze across the damp plain. It blurred the outlines of bodies, dulled the shine of shattered armor, softened the hard truth of what had been lost. The river carried its dead silently, making no distinction between Egyptian, Hittite, mercenary, or prince. Along both banks, silence claimed everything except the creak of broken wood as currents pulled the remains of chariots downstream. Ramesses stood at the water's edge, a dark silhouette against the thinning haze. His armor had been scrubbed clean, yet blood clung to the seams in stains that water could no longer wash away. Behind him, what remained of his army moved like restless ghosts, burying the fallen, tending to trembling horses, gathering arrows that could still be salvaged. When the camp was rebuilt, it felt less like a fortress and more like a refuge, shelter for those who had outlived the storm. No one dared call the silence peace. For across the river the Hittites remained, thousands strong, armed, watchful, their fires flickering like distant sparks in the nighttime mist. Too weak to advance and too proud to retreat, the two armies merely stared at one another across the water, each waiting for the other to commit the first regretful act. Among the Egyptians, talk of victory bloomed quickly. Scribes eager to shape the day into something worthy of remembrance began carving fresh versions of the battle, versions in which the Pharaoh stood alone against an entire host, where Amun himself guided his chariot through a storm of spears. Soldiers repeated these tales with growing confidence. Stories, after all, were the only rations left when food and certainty had run dry. Across the river, the camp of Muwatalli II simmered in a heavy, frustrated quiet. The Hittite king had lost more than warriors. Several vassal lords wavered in their loyalty, their trust shaken by the chaos of the previous day. Princes from Carchemish and lesser cities argued bitterly over whose troops had broken first. Envoys from Lucca and Ugarit begged permission to return home, their petty anxieties louder even than the groans of the wounded. Muwatalli heard every plea with a cold, silent patience. He had not been defeated, but he had not prevailed either. That thin difference offered little comfort to a great king. At dusk he rode out to survey the field himself. The wind carried the sour smell of rot from shallow graves. Across the river, Egyptian tents shimmered faintly in the dying light. Somewhere within that camp, the pharaoh he had intended to crush lived still, piecing together his legend from the shattered remains of the day. Muwatalli turned away before the bitterness reached his face. Rain returned in the night, harder and colder than before. It drowned the remaining fires and seeped into the earth, soaking the hastily dug graves until soil and memory dissolved together. In the Egyptian camp, water gathered in footprints left by men who would never march again. Yet beneath makeshift awnings, the scribes continued their work. Papyrus pages, blotting as ink ran in thin black rivulets. Their words were steady even when the truth was not. The king of Egypt smote the vile land of Hatti. His Majesty stood alone, none beside him. At the war council, the pharaoh's commanders argued fiercely. Some insisted on crossing the river and finishing the fight, claiming the Hittites were too battered to resist another assault. Others begged for withdrawal, warning the troops were spent, the chariot teams broken, the survivors barely able to lift their weapons. The debate grew sharp and hopeless until Ramesses finally raised his hand. He spoke without anger, his voice worn by dust and sleeplessness. Egypt, he said, would not waste her sons chasing shadows across the river. They would hold the field they had bled for, and from that ground the world would accept whatever truth the temples later carved. It was not cowardice, it was recognition. A kingdom could be conquered by story as surely as by spear. On the opposite bank, Muwatalli reached a similar decision. His army was the heart of his empire. To throw it against the Egyptians again would serve neither gods nor ancestors. He ordered the wounded gathered, the dead burned, the banners repaired. Under a white flag, a single messenger approached the Egyptian camp. He carried no treaty, only a small message. The war between great kings was over, for now. Whether exhaustion or strategy inspired the truce, no man could say. For a single day, the river became neutral ground. Boats glided quietly across the dark water, exchanging prisoners, returning stolen horses, trading wine for clean water. Soldiers who had tried to kill one another just hours before now met on the banks with cautious curiosity. Some exchanged small keepsakes, a ring, a belt clasp, a strip of foreign cloth. The war had burned away titles and hatred, leaving only the shared relief of survival. By the third morning, the rain had passed. The plains smelled of wet grass instead of blood. The Egyptians began dismantling their camp, loading carts with whatever could be carried and burying what could not. The horses snorted restlessly. The soldiers moved with the quiet numbness of men who had given everything. They had not conquered Kadesh, but they had not been destroyed either. That thin balance, fragile as reed parchment, would soon be shaped into the greatest victory Egypt had ever proclaimed. Before departing, Ramesses rode along the riverbank one last time. The water shimmered red gold beneath the rising sun. Across the river, the Hittite host had withdrawn to higher ground, their presence reduced to distant shapes against the hills. The Pharaoh watched for a long while, listening for chariot wheels that would never return. Then he turned south, and his army followed him down the long road home, through valleys they had once seized with pride and lost just as quickly. Villagers lined the path as the Egyptians passed, eyes full of reverence and fear. Stories of the battle had already outraced the soldiers who survived it. Every retelling grew more dramatic. Some claimed Ramesses had slaughtered the Hittites with his bare hands. Others whispered that only divine intervention saved him. The Pharaoh offered no correction. Silence was fertile soil for legend. Behind them, the plain slowly returned to stillness. New grass crept over scorched earth. The river polished its stones until they gleamed again. Time gathered the dead into its quiet embrace. Only the walls of Kadesh remained unchanged, dark, patient, indifferent. Merchants reopened their stalls. Farmers plowed the fields. Life resumed as though two empires had not nearly torn the world apart. Yet beneath the calm, the border between Egypt and Hatti still smoldered. In later years, Muwatalli would boast to his brother Hattusili that he had humbled the Pharaoh and crushed the cities of the south, though even he struggled to truly believe it. Ramesses, for his part, carved his version into the temples of Luxor, Abydos, Karnak, and Abu Simbel, reliefs showing him alone in a sea of enemies, chariot drawn by gods, victory shining without end. The truth that both kings had survived and neither had triumphed served neither ruler. And so the Orontes kept the secret. Its waters never revealed which side deserved the day. When the last Egyptian banner drifted beyond the southern horizon, and the Hittite horns faded behind the distant hills, the world settled briefly into balance, a balance born not of peace, but of exhaustion. And thus, the Battle of Kadesh ended as it had begun, not with conquest, but with endurance. Two empires, two gods, one river between them, each believing its survival a divine gift, each knowing, in the quietest corners of truth, that survival alone had been the miracle. When the Pharaoh turned south at last, the land seemed strangely changed. The same roads they had marched with pride now stretched longer, quieter, haunted by everything they had gained and everything they had lost. Chapter 10. Return to Egypt. The long road south unraveled beneath the weary Egyptian host like a ribbon of dust and memory. Behind the marching columns, a pale cloud drifted upward, so thick and unbroken that it softened the line between the living who walked onward and the dead who lay unburied far behind them. The wounded were carried in rattling carts or supported by comrades, their faces hollowed by sleepless nights and too many visions they wished to forget. Chariots creaked along the road, their rims bound tightly with rope where splintered spokes had been replaced. The sacred banners of Amun and Ra fluttered dully in the breeze, their once bright dyes muted by grime and dried blood. Villagers emerged cautiously as the procession passed, some offering jars of cool water, others simply standing at a respectful distance, unable to decide whether they were witnessing a triumph or a miracle of endurance. At the head of the army rode Ramesses II, his armor newly polished, though the shine could not disguise the fatigue beneath it. His face gave nothing away. He had forbidden mourning on the march. The gods favored us, he reminded his officers, and Egypt must see it with her own eyes. And so the army moved forward as though in victory parade, even as each footstep grew heavier. The first weeks of the return became an indistinct blur, towns and outposts appearing and fading like dreams. Everywhere they stopped, priests and governors greeted the Pharaoh with processions, flowers, offerings of cattle and wine, praising him as conqueror. Yet none dared ask how the battle had truly ended. To question a pharaoh was to challenge the balance of the universe itself. By the time the army reached the approaches to Ramesses, the story had already transformed beyond recognition. Messengers had carried word ahead. The king of Egypt had shattered the Hittite host through divine courage alone. Crowds gathered at the city gates, singing hymns, their voices swelling with gratitude for a victory few could truly imagine. Even the exhausted soldiers straightened under the welcome, forcing smiles to match the celebration. Ramesses had grown during the king's absence. New walls and temples rose from the earth, half completed, covered in early carvings of battles not yet fought and victories not yet realized. The entire city seemed to breathe prophecy. As Ramesses entered, priests of Amun lifted their hands toward the sun and proclaimed, "He who conquers by the will of Amun returns." Their voices echoed along the colonnades like thunder softened by distance. The king dismounted before the great hall, removed his blue war crown, and handed it to his attendants. For a moment the weight of it lingered on his brow. Then a faint smile broke through, not born of pride, but of recognition. The story that Egypt needed had already begun to weave itself around him. Within days, teams of artisans arrived from Thebes and Abydos. Stonemasons took up their chisels, beginning the vast cycles of reliefs that would immortalize the campaign. At Luxor, they carved Ramesses towering in his chariot, loosing arrows into a sea of Hittite warriors. At Karnak, Abydos, and Ramesses, similar scenes emerged, each wall repeating the same radiant king, untouched by fear, surrounded by enemies he alone defeated. Lines were copied from one temple to another until the repetition itself became sacred. Court scribes drafted official accounts, the poem of Pentor and the bulletin of the campaign. Papyrus copies spread across Egypt, read aloud in festivals and written in the schools of Memphis and Thebes. Young scribes learned the hieroglyphs of Kadesh before they learned to write their own names. Over time, even the men who had fought at the Orontes found themselves repeating the legend. It was easier to embrace the myth than to recall the truth. That victory and disaster had walked so closely together, they were nearly indistinguishable. In taverns, wandering storytellers embellished the tale further. The pharaoh's chariot racing above the ground, the Hittite king bowing in fear, the sky opening as Amun struck the enemy with fire. What had been survival became epic. What had been chaos became destiny fulfilled. Officials followed the king's lead. They commissioned small commemorative scarabs engraved with the day of victory at Kadesh, offering them to nobles and priests. These little tokens, found centuries later from the Delta to Nubia, were tiny echoes of an empire repeating its chosen truth. At Luxor, Ramesses dedicated a new sanctuary to Amun. Its walls portrayed divine hands placing the blue war crown upon his head, the gods themselves woven into his life story. In these carvings, the pharaoh was not merely ruler, but favored son, half mortal, half eternal. Outside the temples, life resumed with remarkable swiftness. Taxes were collected. Ships bound for Byblos once again carried timber and copper along the coast. Scribes tallied grain shipments as if the world had not trembled mere months earlier. Only the soldiers carried the memory of that trembling, the screams, the heat, the thick dust rising beneath chariot wheels, the fragile heartbeat of survival. yet they rarely spoke of it. The truth felt too brittle beside the grandeur carved in stone. Ramesses did not revise the story. He knew permanence mattered more than honesty. Stone outlived doubt. Stone outlived fear. If Egypt believed him invincible, then invincibility would become real enough, real. In his audience halls, emissaries arrived with gifts and greetings from neighboring courts. Even letters once again passed between Egypt and the Hittites, careful, balanced, devoid of hostility. Though no silver chests were sent to Muwatalli II, courtesy softened the long road toward future peace. Privately, the pharaoh understood the cost. Thousands of Egyptian dead lay unburied beyond the Orontes. The treasury had been drained to equip the campaign. Yet standing in his palace, surrounded by walls that proclaimed his eternal triumph, he allowed himself to believe the myth that bore his name. That belief, as much as his chariots or his gods, became the cornerstone of his reign. Years later, visitors to Ramesses would walk along the great temple walls, marveling at the scenes carved in perfect detail. They saw a god-king in his glory, unwavering, unbreakable, victorious beyond question. None could imagine the fear that once haunted the real man, the smoke, the chaos, the desperate struggle to survive a day that had nearly erased him. The myth had overtaken the truth, and by doing so, secured its immortality. On the night the final inscription was completed, Ramesses walked the perimeter of the temple alone. Torches flickered along the scaffolding, their light casting immense shadows across the stone. Above him, the sculpted figure of the king towered larger than life. Unstained, eternal, everything he could not be. For a long moment, Ramesses studied the carved face as though gazing upon a stranger. Then he nodded once, softly, and turned away. Outside, the city rested beneath a quiet sky. The forges lay cold. The soldiers were asleep. The gods themselves seemed still. And in that hush, the pharaoh's victory finally became complete. Not over Kadesh, not over Hatti, but over time, memory, and the fragile truth that history often leaves behind. Chapter 11, The Hittite Countermoves. Far to the north, where the winds skim across bare stone and cold plateaus, the echoes of Kadesh drifted home in distorted fragments. The battle that Egypt celebrated with chisels and hymns arrived in the Hittite lands as little more than a tangle of rumors. Merchants returning from the south insisted Ramesses had been shattered beyond recovery. Wandering caravans swore the Egyptians had swept across Syria like a desert storm. Truth traveled slower than horses and thinner than smoke. In Hattusa, the great capital of the Hittites, the news was received not with shouts or gasps, but with an unnerving silence. The city, stern, disciplined, hewn from black basalt and timber, stood high above the world like a watchman who had forgotten how to rest. Its banners snapped against a cold wind, and inside the stone-walled council hall, the king's couriers knelt before the assembled lords. Their message was grim. Thousands of soldiers gone, chariot regiments broken, vassal kingdoms wavering. Amuru, ever unsteady in its loyalties, teetered once more. Other border states hesitated to send their tribute at all. The frontiers of Hatti rippled, fragile as cloth caught in a storm. Muwatalli II's return to the capital was slow and somber. His army limped through the northern passes, carts heavy with the wounded and with the shrouded bodies of fallen commanders. Cities in Syria had not fallen, but neither were they secure. Their rulers watched the horizon with uncertainty, unsure which master now truly held power. Though the king had survived and preserved his crown, the shadow of doubt followed him like a second cloak. Once, he had commanded the largest army in the world. Now, even survival felt uncomfortably close to defeat. When he finally crossed the gates of Hattusa, the crowds greeted him dutifully, yet without the fire of celebration. For days afterward, the king spoke little. His palace shutters remained closed, even when sunlight fell bright on the courtyards. Only at night did attendants hear footsteps pacing across the upper chambers, a ruler wrestling with a future that refused to settle. Eventually, the machinery of court life resumed. The scribes composed a proclamation declaring the battle a triumph of the storm god. The king of Egypt came with deceit, but the gods lifted my spear, and his armies scattered. These words traveled southward through the vassal states, like a counterweight to Egyptian grandeur. But Muwatalli knew well the hollowness beneath the script. Kadesh had not granted victory, only survival. To restore the balance of power, he dispatched his brother, Hattushili, sharp-minded, patient, and far too competent, to govern the northern provinces. It was authority wrapped in exile, for the lands he controlled bordered the restless kingdom of Assyria. There, a new force was rising beneath King Adad-nirari, claiming dominion over territories that once belonged to Mitanni. His demands for tribute were unmistakable, an ancient warning that war waited just beyond the frontier. Already stretched thin by the south, Muwatalli offered gifts instead of soldiers: gold, horses, carved ivory, payment for time. Hattushili's letters from the frontier were stripped of politeness. "Assyria spreads like sickness," he wrote. "If they are not stopped now, they will devour everything." Yet the king's thoughts remained fixed on Syria. He ordered the fortification of Carchemish, the hinge between the empires. Stonecutters labored through the winter, raising walls thick enough to withstand rams, towers where signal fires could be seen miles across the plain. Merchants, hardened by years of uncertainty, offered reluctant praise. When they resumed paying tribute, twice the usual amount, the scribes recorded it with care. The obligations of Carchemish have been renewed. Amuru, ever the opportunist, thrived amid the shifting borders. King Benteshina was rewarded with new lands and a marriage alliance. His bride, the Hittite princess, Gasulawiya, arrived with carts laden with gold and grain. With one gesture, Muwatalli secured a slippery ally more tightly than any chain might have held him. From his seat between sea and mountains, Benteshina sent streams of reports to Carchemish, tracking Egyptian patrols, caravans, even the whispers of priests invoking Pharaoh's name. Thus the world split into two mirrored stories. Ramesses carved his triumph into stone. Muwatalli shaped his own into clay. Between these versions, the truth hardened like cooling bronze, unalterable, contradictory, immutable. The soldiers who had actually stood at Kadesh said nothing. Their silence was the only honest account left. Still, the Hittite Empire lived. Muwatalli rebuilt his armies, filling the empty chariot ranks with young men from the western lands. Tribute flowed in from mountain tribes, copper, timber, silver, feeding an empire that no longer conquered by force, but endured through obligation and memory. New treaties were pressed into clay, their seals marked with the double-headed eagle. They were not declarations of supremacy, they were quiet promises to survive. Through these uneasy years, Hattushili's influence grew. Soldiers spoke of him with a rare loyalty, admiring his calm counsel and steady leadership. Muwatalli saw in his brother both an asset and a shadow of future rivalry. In the spring, Assyria struck again, raiding border villages, stealing cattle, overturning sacred boundary stones. The king sent orders north, but no reinforcements. Hattusili fought alone. When he drove the Assyrians back, his report was brief. The gods favor patience. It was a truth that applied to the empire as much as the frontier. As the decade turned, a fragile balance settled over the land. Egypt guarded its borders with monuments. Hatti guarded its future with vigilance. The cities between them, Byblos, Tunip, Ugarit, learned the art of survival through subtle shifting of loyalties. At Carchemish, the new walls stood finished, carved with symbols of divine guardianship. The scaffolding was left in place. Everyone understood they would need it again. For the Hittites, new peace was only a season, borrowed from the gods, never owned. Muwatalli still dreamed of reclaiming the south, yet his words grew fewer, his decrees more restrained. The world was changing, slowly for tradition, swiftly for kings. And though he could not foresee it, Muwatalli II was among the last rulers of the old Hittite order, standing at the fading edge of the Bronze Age's final glow. Chapter 12. Years of Border Conflict. The memory of Kadesh never truly disappeared. It lingered, reshaping itself with every passing season. In Egypt it was sung like a triumphal hymn. In Hatti, it was treated as a stern lesson carved into the bones of the empire. And between these two great powers stretched a restless frontier, a long ribbon of dusty valleys and uncertain towns where merchants haggled, soldiers watched the horizon, and the boundary between peace and war faded like a mirage. For many years after Kadesh, conflict did not cease. It simply dissolved into something quieter, more ambiguous. There were no grand invasions, no thunderous clashes of nations, only drifting clouds of dust, the whisper of marching feet, and the endless exchange of rumors. Armies appeared at sunrise, raised their banners, then vanished into the hills before night. Maps in both capitals shifted as easily as sand dunes moved by the wind. Egypt struck first. In the 8th year of Ramesses II's reign, the Pharaoh marched north again, seeking to reinforce the glory he had carved on temple walls. His forces swept toward Tunip, a fortified hill town guarding the Orontes. Later reliefs in Luxor would show the siege as clean and heroic, ladders raised with perfect order, archers kneeling in divine formation, the king towering above all. In truth, the battle dragged on for 3 long days, the outcome uncertain to the very end. Tunip fell, then rose again, and the soldiers who fought in those months remembered little except the monotony. Oppressive heat, raids on nameless hamlets, the smell of sweat and fear clinging to leather armor. They fought less to conquer than to convince the enemy that the border had shifted, even if it had not. The Hittites answered in the same quiet, patient style. Their generals struck at Egypt's coastal allies, burning storehouses, cutting trade routes, then disappearing before Egyptian reinforcements arrived. Victory was measured not by how many enemies lay dead, but by how many harvests were spoiled, how many caravans turned back. Amuru, faithless, flexible, opportunistic, wavered endlessly. Its ruler, Benteshina, bound to the Hittites by marriage yet forever tempted by Egyptian promises, sent spies and letters to both courts. His caravans carried secrets more often than goods. In him, the age revealed its nature, survival through ambiguity. Beyond Syria, other powers waited like wolves at the tree line. Assyria tightened its grip over the upper Euphrates. When Muwatalli II died, his successor, likely Urhi-Teshub, known as Mursili III, found himself forced to turn his gaze eastward. Neither great empire had the strength to wage full war any longer, and so the frontier cooled, not from peace, but from exhaustion. Meanwhile, in Egypt, Ramesses' scribes continued their ritual of recording victories. Rebellious towns in Canaan were humbled, old trade routes restored, and disloyal chiefs punished. But the records never mentioned how quickly these same towns rebelled again, nor how fragile the Pharaoh's grasp truly was. By his 9th year, Ramesses led another campaign into Syria and laid siege to Ni, but the city held firm, supported quietly by Hittite supply lines. The siege failed, yet temple reliefs would later depict it as a flawless triumph. Defeats were recast as divine strategy, setbacks smoothed into sacred narrative. While Egypt polished its inscriptions, the Hittites focused on survival. Carchemish grew from a frontier town into a citadel. New markets bustled behind high walls as caravans carried goods and whispers toward Ugarit. The northern provinces became a belt of vigilance, a region loyal only until the next famine. Trade suffered everywhere. Pirate bands from the Aegean, perhaps early sea peoples, began raiding the eastern Mediterranean, disrupting the fragile lifelines that linked coast to empire. Merchants in Ugarit wrote desperate warnings onto clay. The sea has turned hostile. Ships do not return. With the sea routes broken, inland caravans grew richer, and bandits richer still. Economies strained. Silver prices tripled in Ugarit's markets. Egypt faced grain shortages and levied heavier burdens on its farmers. On the Hittite highlands, drought turned fertile fields into husks of dust. People looked to the skies, praying for rain and cursing their kings when the heavens stayed silent. Both empires remained fixated on each other, blind to the slow unraveling beneath their feet. By Ramesses' 10th year, another campaign reached Tunip once more. Egypt occupied it briefly before a Hittite counterattack drove them out from the direction of Carchemish. Both kingdoms proclaimed victory. Sculptors in Thebes etched scenes of Ramesses storming the gates. Scribes in Hattusa declared that the king of Egypt had retreated before the majesty of the storm god. The divide between truth and inscription grew wide enough to swallow whole generations. War lost its rhythm. No sweeping victories, no decisive collapses, only weary patrols across the same lonely outposts. Soldiers aged on the same walls their fathers had guarded. Children learned to fall asleep to the distant echo of drums. Amid this long dusk of conflict, one figure rose quietly within Hatti, Hattushili. Brother of the late king, ruler of the northern provinces, he had defended the eastern frontier against Assyria and governed with calm efficiency. His surviving letters reveal a man practical to the core. Our granaries are empty. The people grow tired of wars that give no bread. His tone carried no bitterness, only clarity. Yet his ambition, though soft-spoken, was unmistakable. In Egypt, Ramesses felt his own burdens. The empire still glittered in the sun, but continuous campaigning strained its wealth. Temples demanded offerings, workers demanded grain, and even the gods grew weary of blessing endless conflict. When one year the Nile's floods arrived late, priests murmured that Amun was warning Egypt to turn inward once more. Then came plague. In the 11th year, sickness swept across northern lands. Hittite records lamented a wasting of the people. Crops failed, famine followed, trade slowed to a trickle. Barley rose beyond the reach of ordinary families. Even the powerful were helpless before hunger and disease. And so letters resumed, tentatively, politely, between Egypt and Hatti. Requests for prisoner exchanges, condolences for deaths, queries about grain. Diplomacy became another ritual of endurance. No grand ambitions, only the steady maintenance of a world fraying at the edges. The border still shifted, But the energy behind it had changed. Battles dwindled, treaties shortened, memories lengthened. The Great Bronze Age of conquest had begun slipping quietly into an age of negotiation, an age sustained not by dreams of empire, but by the exhaustion of those tasked with defending it. Scribes who chronicled these years wrote half history, half lament. They described ruined harvests, merchant fleets swallowed by raids, priests sorrowing at the silence of the gods. Both empires still claimed divine favor, but the heavens answered with nothing. When a Hittite envoy finally arrived in Thebes bearing letters sealed with the double-headed eagle, the reception was careful, ceremonial, almost fragile. Gold and silver exchanged hands, symbolic offerings, as though the gifts themselves could buy back the decades lost to mutual obsession. Behind polite smiles, both sides understood what neither dared say aloud. Something deeper than rivalry was ending. For the first time in generations, neither empire possessed the strength to invade the other. Their armies still drilled, their temples still sang, but the rhythm of ambition had slowed to a tired heartbeat. What began at Kadesh, as thunder, had faded into a long, lingering echo. And in that quiet, ordinary life resumed. Farmers rebuilt terraces, traders reopened roads, children grew up hearing stories of kings who had once commanded the heavens to move. What those stories did not say, could not say, was that the kings themselves were now trapped in the long twilight of endurance. Yet from this weariness, the seeds of peace were planted. Letters mentioned famine, then aid, and eventually, trust. Not because diplomacy triumphed, but because exhaustion softened the old certainties. The long war that had stretched across decades was finally dimming, ending not with glory, but with necessity. Peace, fragile and overdue, began to take shape in the quiet spaces between two fading empires. Chapter 13. The Great Peace Treaty. After decades of conflict, the great empires of Egypt and Hittite bowed not to one another, but to the inevitability of time. 2 decades of relentless raids, famine, plague, and border skirmishes had shown that endurance alone could no longer maintain their dominion. The thunder of war had faded, replaced by the quiet authority of ink pressed into clay. In the winter of 1260 BC, the first tentative messages passed between the two courts, carrying the unspoken acknowledgement that survival demanded compromise. In Thebes, Ramesses II had grown older. The golden weight of his crown pressed heavier on his brow, and the lines of his face spoke of years spent weaving legend from endurance. The stories of battles past still flowed from his lips, but their cadence was softer, measured. The fields were exhausted, the people fatigued by taxes and conscription. Even the priests whispered that the gods might favor rest, far to the north, where Hatti endured under its new king. Hattusili III had claimed the Hittite throne after the death of Muwatalli II. His path to power had been hard, involving the deposition of a nephew, the quelling of rivals, and the painstaking reunification of a fractured empire. Shaped by patience and calculation, he ruled with a colder pragmatism than his brother, acutely aware of the limitations of force. The eastern frontier shivered under Assyrian pressure, the western coast demanded tribute, and the Egyptian border remained a fresh scar he had no desire to reopen. Both kings understood that the time for grand conquest had passed. The first exchanges were cautious, formal, and measured. Written in the diplomatic language of Akkadian, the letters spoke of goodwill, mutual hardships, famine, and the shared desire for stability. Beneath their polite surface lay recognition. Neither empire could continue this war without further devastation. Years of negotiation followed, with envoys traversing deserts bearing clay tablets, gold, and oaths of fidelity. In Hattusa, scribes pressed cuneiform into soft clay, the air smelling of oil and metal. In Thebes, papyrus scribes mirrored their work in hieroglyphs, ensuring the words would endure for eternity. Though the kings never met face to face, each understood the other completely. Their realms were mirror images of pride and power, magnificent yet worn. Each could destroy the other, but neither could afford to risk it. The treaty that emerged contained 18 articles. The first 3 declared everlasting peace, likening the kingdoms to the sons of the same mother. The next 6 outlined mutual defense, promising aid if either faced a third-party threat. Subsequent clauses protected succession, guaranteed recognition of heirs, and safeguarded fugitives and refugees. The gods of both lands were invoked as witnesses, not merely as symbols, but as living guarantors. Every major deity was named Amun, Ra, Ishtar, Seth, and called to bless fidelity and curse deceit. 2 copies were made, one in cuneiform for Hatti, cast onto a silver tablet engraved with twin images, Hattusili before the storm god, Ramesses before Ra, equal in stature and intent. The Egyptian version, carved in temple walls and papyrus scrolls, phrased the agreement subtly in Pharaoh's favor, though both versions reflected the pride of their respective kings. Negotiations had been arduous. Egypt's vizier Passer made 3 perilous journeys with caravans heavy with gold, lapis, and fine linen across deserts that bleached both memory and flesh. At Hattusa, he met Hittite envoys Hattusili and the interpreter Halepa, laboring for months to translate meaning as precisely as words. In diplomacy, a single misstep could be fatal. Each sentence weighed against centuries of blood. When the treaty was finally sealed, ceremonies mirrored across continents. In Thebes, priests called upon Amun's blessing as Ramesses displayed the silver tablet. In Anatolia, Hattusili offered wine and sacrifice upon the new stone tablet in the citadel, honoring the storm god. For a fleeting moment, both empires shared silence, the absence of war. The peace was immediate. Trade reopened along the eastern coast. Caravans resumed their journeys through Byblos, Aleppo, and Amuru, and famine eased in both lands. Farmers tilled once abandoned fields. Sailors ventured safely into the Mediterranean once more. The names of the kings mattered little compared to the simple knowledge that roads and rivers were safe again. For the first time in generations, children in Syria grew up without seeing armies trample their lands. Priests declared the gods' will accomplished, though it was human fatigue and practical necessity, not divine mercy, that had achieved it. Hattusili sent letters of friendship to Thebes. Ramesses returned gifts and words of trust. The threats that had once commanded vengeance were replaced by promises of continuity. One clay tablet, later preserved in Hattusa, recorded Ramesses' words: "The great king of Hatti is my brother. There is peace between us, and our sons will not raise the sword again." Both empires stored the treaty under the watch of their gods, within Karnak's sacred walls and Hattusa's citadel archives. Though the scripts and phrasing differed, their meaning was the same. Survival had been chosen over conquest. The bronze that had once armed them now aged, green with time, and the scribes who compared this treaty to myth recognized something extraordinary. Unlike legend, this was real. Unlike war, it would endure. For the first time, the Near East learned the quiet power of peace, not imposed by victory, but grown from exhaustion, patience, and the careful ink of human hands. History, for all its later retellings, began here. Chapter 14, Marriage and Reconciliation. In the wake of the Great Peace Treaty, the world of Egypt and Hatti shifted in subtle but profound ways. Messengers carried more than words. They carried warmth, gestures that had once been unthinkable between two empires that had sought each other's destruction. Letters moved back and forth, each sealed with royal emblems, calling one another brother, a term that took practice to live up to in action. From these careful exchanges arose a bold idea, a marriage to bind the kingdoms in blood, anchoring peace in a union of dynasties. For Ramesses II, the arrangement became a symbol of his reign, a living testament that two worlds, once divided by conflict, could now meet in harmony. The Hittite court offered the hand of their elder princess, daughter of Queen Puduhepa, whose own name in her native tongue was lost to time. In Egypt, she became known as Ma Thorna Ferur, she who beholds the beauty of Ra, a name that carried both blessing and transformation. Her presence wove her foreign gods into Egypt's divine order, quietly folded into the rituals of the household and the cadence of daily life. Preparations unfolded across both empires. Caravans set out from Hattusa, laden with dowries as grand as the promise they carried. 1,000 talents of silver, hundreds of gold pieces, tens of thousands of bronze weapons, hundreds of horses with chariots trimmed in silver, and herds beyond count. The journey south spanned months, passing through Kakamega, the lands of Amuru, and Byblos. Villages and cities along the way lined the roads with awe, as though history itself had reversed its course, celebrating what had once seemed impossible. Envoys documented every stop, every offering, and every omen along the route, recording the marriage's significance for generations to come. At the border forts of Canaan, Egyptian officials rode out to meet the procession. Men in white linen robes, heads shaven smooth, greeted the convoy, speaking in measured phrases, carrying gifts and rituals for both Egyptian and Hittite deities. Lapis and papyrus were exchanged, gold for silver, words for silent blessing. Finally, the princess reached Ramesses, the city forged for war, now transformed into a stage for peace. Its gates were draped in banners, streets lined with flowers harvested from the Nile Delta marshes, and the scent of cedar and myrrh hung in the evening air. Ramesses waited at the palace, older now, a ruler shaped by decades of triumph and survival, whose monuments spoke louder than any word. As the princess stepped down from her chariot, the pharaoh extended his hand, and for a fleeting instant, the clamor of the crowd faded. Two dynasties, two empires, met in a single gesture. The marriage ceremony unfolded with ritual precision, priests from both lands presiding, blending languages, faiths, and traditions. Her Hittite diadem rested on the altar beside Egypt's queenly symbols, transformed rather than discarded. The feast lasted days, with dancers from Memphis, musicians from Anatolia, and food from every corner of both realms. Scribes recorded every detail, preserving the moment for eternity. Ma Thorna Ferur quickly adapted to her new life. She learned Egyptian, walked temple processions with poise, and was celebrated for bringing prosperity and favor. The Nile's floods rose generously, the harvests flourished, and gifts of grain and metal strengthened both empires. She corresponded with Nefertari, Ramesses' first wife, addressing her as sister in the lands of the gods, exchanging letters filled with advice, perfume, and jewelry. These writings, preserved on clay and papyrus, reveal a human dimension. Women discussing family, friendship, and mutual respect, not strategy or conquest. The marriage bore fruit beyond symbols. Trade surged along the coastal and inland routes. Copper, cedar, horses, and wine traveled north and south, Egyptian grain fed Hittite towns, and Hittite metal replenished temples and armories in Egypt. Within 5 years, commerce had tripled. The seas that once carried fleets of war now carried goods, bringing wealth and security. Festivals celebrated the new era, and the Pharaoh expanded his palace, dedicating halls to the harmony between Egypt and Hatti. Reliefs depicted him seated beside his queen beneath twin symbols, the sun disk of Ra and the storm god's lightning bolt, the first time a foreign deity had been incorporated into Egyptian sacred art. Resistance remained. Some priests whispered that the purity of Egypt's divine house was compromised by foreign influence, and critics murmured about Ramesses' pragmatism. Yet the people embraced the spectacle, the procession, and the promise of stability, for they had grown up amidst generations of war. 16 years later, in the 44th year of his reign, Ramesses welcomed a second Hittite princess, the younger sister of Mathorn-Ferrier, further solidifying the alliance. Her name is lost to time, but her presence reinforced the fragile bond between the two empires. Peace endured longer than any campaign or conquest. Letters flowed between the queens, preserved in fragments of ink and clay, Nefertari to Mathorn-Ferrier, praising her wisdom and kindness. The Hittite princess to Egypt, thanking them for sending a physician to heal her court. Through these exchanges, a quiet respect grew, nurtured by women who maintained what their husbands had begun. Prosperity spread across the land. Ports reopened, artisans thrived, and temples overflowed with offerings. Trade volumes tripled, and ships from Cyprus and Crete once more brought goods to the Syrian coast. The old wars had left scars, but they now gave way to a fleeting golden age. Ramesses grew old amid abundance, Ramesses sparkling with palaces, gardens, and canals reflecting sunlight like polished metal. The Hittite queen lived quietly, honored, her identity a bridge between nations, neither fully foreign nor entirely Egyptian. Her portraits show serenity beside the pharaoh, who had long since become a living myth. As he walked the temple corridors, past the chariot at Kadesh, and the carved gods leaning close, new inscriptions emerged, not of war, but of blessing. Scenes of kings clasping hands, bridges of gold and silver linking their lands, testified to the endurance of human choice over conflict. At night, the palace gardens resonated with soft music. Hittite lyres and Egyptian flutes wove together in harmony, while children chased fireflies across papyrus-lined pools. The world had not forgotten Kadesh, its ghosts lingering, yet for the first time, rulers and heirs measured worth not in conquest, but in patience, endurance, and the fragile beauty of peace. 2 generations, once divided by rivers of war, now shared the same horizon, learning to coexist beneath the same sun. Chapter 15, Legacy and the Twilight of the Bronze Age. In the long quiet aftermath of the Great Peace, the Near East seemed to inhale as if released from a storm. The truce between Egypt and Hatti endured far beyond expectation, long enough for Ramesses' sons to grow into men, and for the clatter of chariots on the Orontes to fade into memory. For a brief span, the world appeared to pause, as if the land itself had granted a season of rest. Caravans traversed roads once soaked in blood. Traders passed through Kadesh without fear, no longer recalling its walls as instruments of war. Kadesh, the city that had drawn kings into ruin, now prospered through commerce. Linen, cedar, and tin moved along its streets, markets brimming with voices speaking foreign tongues. Ships from Cyprus and Crete docked at its harbor, while vessels from Egypt carried grain and papyrus along the coastline. Laughter filled its plazas, merchants haggled, and the rhythm of peace became a habit, steady as the rising sun. Ramesses, the capital forged for glory and war, reached the height of its splendor. Courtyards gleamed with white limestone, reflecting the sky in still pools. The aged Pharaoh walked the avenues of his youth, passing statues of his younger self, forever unwrinkled, unbending, eternal. Ramesses had already become legend in his lifetime, a king immortalized by stone, his victories over Hatti carved deep enough to defy erosion and memory alike. Temples bore his image alone, the pharaoh in his chariot, enemies scattered at his back, gods leaning in as witnesses. Few remembered the river that had swallowed the dead of Kadesh, or the weary treaties signed in exhaustion. History, he had learned, favors the conqueror over the survivor. North of Egypt, Hatti's rulers maintained their lands with caution, passing power from father to son, rebuilding cities in stone, codifying law on clay tablets. The world seemed whole again, anchored in trade, faith, and shared prosperity, yet beneath the surface tensions quietly stirred. By the mid-13th century BCE, the balance that had preserved decades of peace began to fray. In the Aegean, kingdoms rose and fell like waves, and the sea peoples, an assortment of marauders from distant coasts, struck suddenly, bringing fire and desperation. Ugarit, once thriving in peace, sent urgent pleas for aid. The Hittites were too burdened to respond. Assyria pressed into lands the Hittites could no longer defend. Trade faltered, grain became scarce. Roads that once carried envoys, brides, and caravans now carried refugees. The intricate web connecting the Bronze Age world began to unravel, thread by fragile thread, leaving silence in the archives. Tablets from the twilight of the era tell of shortages, failed prayers, and gods who seemed deaf. Ugarit fell, its walls crumbled, and the empire of the storm god dissolved into mist over Anatolian mountains. Egypt endured longer, but after Ramesses, even its splendor waned. His sons fractured under internal pressures, temples demanded offerings they could not provide, and workers in Thebes struck for bread and beer. The grand monuments remained, serene and monumental, yet the faith that had built them began to falter. The Bronze Age faded not in a single cataclysm, but gradually, quietly, as empires exhausted themselves and memory began to fade. Yet traces of that age linger in the ruins of Hattusa and Ramesses. Archaeologists would uncover fragments of the Great Peace, Akkadian lines still legible after 3 millennia. Copies rest today in Istanbul and New York, silent testaments to a pact between enemies, the same words echoing, "There shall be peace and brotherhood between us forever." Across the deserts and along the Nile, the monuments of Egypt remain unbroken. Abu Simbel catches the dawn, in the same way it did for Ramesses, the sun illuminating carved faces of gods and kings alike. Modern travelers read the story of Ramesses the Great, unaware that the man behind the monuments once faced the mirror of another king across a river. In that reflection, pride and weariness balanced, and together they discovered the art of endurance, the first glimmer of what peace might look like. History remembers him as a builder, a conqueror, immortal in stone. Yet behind that legend stands the reality of a man who, alongside a rival king, chose peace over destruction. What they built could not last forever, yet its echo endures, in treaties signed after battle, in lowered flags, in agreements that preserve survival over ambition. The world that followed would be smaller, harsher, fashioned from iron rather than bronze. Yet in the fading light of that age, 2 kings glimpsed the truth that conquest alone could never teach. To endure is the highest mastery of power. As the sun sank over the delta, Ramesses watched the horizon turn red. The scent of the sea drifted on the wind. For a fleeting moment, he imagined the distant hum of chariot wheels. Then silence returned, the reeds whispering, the empire he shaped destined to outlast him, yet eventually, too, to fade. Still, memory clings to what endures. Somewhere in that quiet meeting of two weary kings beside a river that refused to choose sides, the Bronze Age closed as it had begun, with men seeking peace, knowing the world would march on without them. My final thoughts or opinion about this story. The story of Egypt and the Hittites is a reminder that history is rarely shaped by victories alone, but by the decisions forged in the quiet aftermath of conflict. What began as rivalry between two of the ancient world's most formidable powers evolved into one of humanity's earliest examples of formal diplomacy, demonstrating that even empires built on war can learn to value stability over supremacy. Their journey, from suspicion to negotiation, from battlefields to a marriage alliance, reveals how deeply survival, pride, and necessity intertwine in shaping political choices. It also shows that peace, once established, can transform the course of civilizations just as profoundly as war. As we trace their rise, their struggles, and ultimately their cooperation, we see how alliances born from hardship can echo far beyond their own age and continue to influence how nations negotiate power today. If you enjoyed unraveling this chapter of ancient history, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps bring more forgotten conflicts, lost alliances, and untold stories back to life. Share your thoughts in the comments and let me know which ancient civilization you'd like to explore next. Until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next journey through the past.